I stood there smiling, the envelope still warm from my hands, as my granddaughter's voice sliced through the cafe. That's just my servant. Laughter erupted around her, sharp and glittering like broken glass. My name never made it to the table. Not Grandma, not Maggie, just servant. After 19 years of bedtime stories, tuition checks, and skipped dinners so she wouldn't have to, I was a ghost holding a gift bag. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The bell over the door chimed softly as Maggie Sloan stepped into the crowded coffee house on State Street. The air was warm with the smell of roasted beans and sugar, the sound of chatter bouncing off the exposed brick walls. She smoothed her simple cardigan, clutching the little gift bag she'd chosen with care. Chloe had always liked clean lines, the sort of minimalist chic Maggie never understood but tried to honor anyway. Inside the bag was a card and a slim envelope, her last piece of support for Chloe's new start. Maggie spotted her granddaughter immediately. Chloe's laughter floated above the din, bright and practiced. She sat surrounded by young faces, her glossy hair catching the morning light that poured through the tall windows. At Chloe's side was Devin, his arm draped casually across the back of her chair as if he owned the space. They all looked so sure of themselves, like the world was nothing but open doors. Maggie's chest swelled with quiet pride as she approached, her footsteps deliberate, a little uneven from the ache in her knees. She rehearsed in her mind what she would say. "I'm proud of you. Your mother would be proud of you too." But before she could even reach the table, Chloe's voice cut across the room. "Oh, that's just my—" Chloe hesitated as though choosing between masks. A sly smile tugged at her lips. "Well, basically my servant." The table erupted in laughter. Devin chuckled, not even glancing at Maggie. One of the other young women covered her mouth, eyes wide in scandalized amusement. Maggie froze, the gift bag dangling from her hand like a mistake. For a moment, her ears rang, as though someone had clapped cymbals next to her head. Her granddaughter's words, the girl she had rocked to sleep, nursed through ear infections, prayed over during every exam, reduced her to a punchline. Her grip tightened on the bag. She could feel the edges of the envelope inside pressing against her palm. The cash she had saved from small sacrifices, her moving expenses gift. Late-night ramen instead of takeout, thrift store coats instead of new. Also, Chloe could move into her new apartment with dignity. Chloe glanced briefly toward her, but her eyes skimmed over like Maggie was nothing more than background noise. She was too busy whispering something to Devin, who smirked and raised his overpriced latte in a mocking toast. Maggie felt a heat rising in her throat, but her face remained still, trained by years of nursing to hide everything behind composure. The girls kept giggling, their laughter spilling out like steam from a broken pipe. She heard words like quaint, old-fashioned, and charity case tossed around. But none cut as deep as Chloe's dismissive smirk. Her legs moved of their own accord. Instead of walking toward the table, Maggie pivoted, sliding into a quieter corner. She set the bag down on the counter, opened it with trembling fingers, and pulled the envelope free. For a second, she stared at the name written in her neat handwriting. Chloe. She thought of the hours behind that money, the double shifts, the bruised feet, the thrift store Christmases. She thought of every night she had whispered into the silence, "Just let me live long enough to see her graduate." Maggie slid the envelope back into her purse. Her decision was made in silence, with no announcement, no confrontation, just a private withdrawal of generosity. She left the cafe without a word. The laughter behind her followed into the street like a cruel song she couldn't turn off. Hours later, in the comfort of her condo, Irene knocked lightly before letting herself in. "Mags, you okay?" Maggie sat at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched tea. She hadn't found words yet. Irene pulled out her phone, her expression grim. "You don't have to explain. Someone posted it." She pressed play. The video showed Chloe, smiling that careful social smile, saying the word servant like it was a badge. The camera caught Maggie in the background, her face still as stone, eyes stricken. The laughter swelled. The comments below the clip were already piling up. Maggie's hand drifted to her purse, to the envelope still safe inside. Her jaw tightened. "Servant," Irene muttered, her eyes flashing. "Oh, sweetheart, she has no idea who she just reduced." Maggie didn't answer. She only stared at the video again, the sound of Chloe's laughter replaying like a wound being reopened. The gift Chloe had never received now lay heavy in Maggie's purse. But what would come from this silence would be heavier still. The kitchen table had turned into an archive of sacrifice. Maggie spread papers across the surface. Yellowed pay stubs folded into thirds, brittle loan statements, photocopied tuition checks with her careful cursive signatures. The numbers bled together, but the weight of them pressed down like bricks. Irene sat across from her, glasses perched low on her nose, calculator in hand. She punched numbers with the efficiency of someone who had balanced ledgers her entire life. 4 years, she muttered. Room, board, fees, plus the interest you swallowed on those personal loans. Her thumb hit the final button, and the calculator chirped back a number that made her eyebrows shoot up. 112,000, give or take a few dollars. Maggie leaned back in her chair. She could still see herself in those years, pulling 12-hour night shifts on the cardiac floor, then coming home to a silent house that smelled of antiseptic and reheated soup. She remembered pawning her mother's wedding ring when Chloe's spring tuition bill came early, then telling Chloe she'd simply misplaced it. Her fingertips brushed the edge of one faded stub, dated January 2006. The ink had nearly disappeared, but the hours stared back at her. 68 worked in a single week. I thought I was giving her wings, Maggie whispered to herself. Turns out I gave her a mask. Irene's sharp gaze softened. She reached across the table, covering Maggie's hand. You itemized every kindness, Mags. She just never bothered to count. Silence stretched, heavy as wet wool. Maggie pushed the papers into a neater stack, her movement steady though her stomach churned. Finally, she pulled a different folder from the sideboard, a leather one, stamped with gold lettering. Inside lay her will. She flipped to the first page, the words stark and indifferent. Beneficiary, Chloe Sloan, sole heir. Maggie stared at the name until it blurred. A voice startled her. Still stands, I see. Paul Grant, her estate attorney, stood in the doorway. Irene had called him, knowing Maggie wouldn't. He entered with a quiet respect, removing his coat and setting his briefcase neatly by the chair before sitting down. His presence was calm, almost clinical, the way doctors announce a prognosis. Yes, Maggie said finally, her voice dry. Still stands, for now. Paul adjusted his tie. I'm guessing that's why I'm here? Maggie folded her hands on the table, the ridges of paper pressing beneath her palms. Not anymore. The words felt like iron in her mouth, heavy but unbreakable. Paul didn't blink. He simply nodded, as if confirming something he'd expected for years. Then let's do this right, he said, cleanly, no loopholes, no openings for her to argue incapacity, undue influence, or mismanagement. Irene gave a satisfied grunt, snapping the calculator shut. About time, she muttered. Maggie exhaled slowly, like a nurse after a long shift when the monitors finally go quiet. She pictured Chloe's smile in that cafe, sharp, dismissive, cutting her down in front of strangers. That smile had burned through every memory of bedtime stories, birthday cakes made from boxed mix, rides to soccer practice in the rusted-out Buick. She closed the folder, the decision sealed in the movement. I want her name gone from every page, Maggie said. Every paper, every account. Paul opened his briefcase with precise hands, pulling out fresh documents. We'll begin with revocation clauses, he explained, laying down sheet after sheet. Then move to redistribution. I'll draft options for charitable funds. You tell me what matters most. Maggie's gaze fell on the stack of pay stubs again. years of her life reduced to ink and faded carbon. She thought of the young women on the nursing floor who came to her for guidance, the first-generation students who reminded her of the girl she once was. "I know what matters," Maggie said, her voice steady now. Paul raised a brow, pen poised. "And that is?" Maggie met his eyes without flinching. "That her betrayal doesn't bury me, that it plants something better." For the first time that night, Irene smiled. "Now you're speaking my language." Paul tapped his pen against the page, a faint rhythm of inevitability. "Then we'll plant it in ink." The call came on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind that pressed clouds low over Madison's rooftops and made the lake look like steel. Maggie recognized Chloe's number immediately. For a moment, she considered letting it ring out, but old habits, the reflex to answer, to provide, died hard. "Grandma." Chloe's voice was syrupy, that polished lilt she used when she wanted something. "I need a little help, just a bridge until I get my first paycheck. Devin and I are looking at apartments, really nice ones near the square. Rent's due Friday, and you know how these places are, super competitive." Maggie gripped the receiver, her thumb tracing the chipped plastic edge. The old script hovered on her tongue. "Of course, honey. How much?" But the words caught, splintered. She saw again that cafe, the laughter, Chloe's dismissive smirk. She inhaled slowly. "No, Chloe." A pause, the kind that stretched into accusation. "No? You mean not right now, or—" "I mean no." Maggie's voice was calm, level. On the other end, Chloe's tone shifted, sharp and incredulous. "Wow. Servants off duty?" Maggie closed her eyes, letting the sting roll over her like a wave breaking on rock. Then she said, clear as glass, "Exactly." There was a click, abrupt and final. The silence in its wake was heavier than any words Chloe could have thrown. When Irene came over later, she found Maggie at the kitchen table again, papers spread but untouched. "You look like a woman who just wrestled a bear," Irene said, setting down a grocery bag with a thud. Maggie gave a small, tired smile. "Chloe called. She wanted rent money. And I told her no." Irene's eyes widened, then softened into something proud. She pulled out a chair and sat. "That's your first no. Now write the second one on paper." Before Maggie could reply, there was a knock at the door. Paul stepped inside, briefcase in hand, as though summoned by the gravity of their conversation. "I've drafted a preliminary revision," he said, sliding a folder across the table. "This version leaves no wiggle room. Explicit exclusion. Every clause airtight." Maggie flipped the folder open. The legal language was dense, lines and sublines that fenced in her intent. Still, one phrase stood out. "Beneficiary removed with prejudice." Her chest felt tight, but not with sorrow, something steadier, like resolve solidifying into bone. "And if she contests," she asked. Paul adjusted his glasses. "She'll lose. I've added clauses that reference your financial contributions. Tuition, living expenses, care. She'll have no grounds." Irene leaned over, tapping the page with one red lacquered nail. "Read this line, Mags." Out loud, Maggie did. "All inheritance hereby rescinded, irrevocable." The words shook in her throat at first, then settled with the weight of finality. Paul cleared his throat. "Now the question is, where do you want it to go? Assets don't vanish. They need a destination." Maggie thought of the stubs, the endless hours traded for Chloe's future that had turned to scorn. Then she thought of the young nursing students who'd shared their dreams with her in break rooms, faces lit with the same hunger she once had. She met Paul's steady gaze. A scholarship fund for first-generation nursing students. Irene let out a low whistle. That'll sting her worse than the no. Paul nodded, already making notes. "We'll file articles of incorporation, tie it directly into your trust. By the time Chloe realizes, it'll be untouchable." Maggie's fingers traced the edges of the document, her pulse finally settling. For the first time in days, she felt oxygen fill her lungs without a weight pressing them down. Still, A flicker of grief lingered, because a grandmother's heart does not simply stop loving, even when betrayed. She buried it quietly, the way she'd buried other wounds, under layers of dignity and silence. Irene watched her, expression fierce. You just gave her the second no. When the time comes, that one will echo a lot louder. Maggie signed the draft with a steady hand. The pen glided across the paper, black ink sealing what words could not undo. Paul collected the pages, sliding them neatly back into his case. This is just the beginning, he said. But trust me, she won't see what's coming. Maggie looked down at her signature, the letters bold and unapologetic. For years she had said yes, thinking it was love. Tonight, for the first time, she understood the power of no. The law office smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper, a kind of permanence baked into its walls. Maggie followed Paul down the carpeted hallway, her sensible shoes muffled by the thick runner. Irene walked at her side, clutching her handbag like it contained something sharper than lipstick and tissues. Paul's office was lined with shelves of leather-bound volumes, but it was his desk that commanded attention. Wide oak, orderly, no nonsense. A single folder lay open in the center, papers stacked with surgical precision. This, Paul said, sliding his chair out, is where it becomes real. Maggie lowered herself into the seat opposite him. Her palms rested flat on the polished surface. For a moment, she stared at her reflection in the desk's sheen. An older woman with tired eyes, but with something new settled in her face. Resolve. Paul adjusted his glasses, tapping the folder. The revised will, Chloe Sloan, fully removed as beneficiary. All assets, liquid and property, redirected to the Maggie Sloan Nursing Scholarship. Irrevocable. He paused, studying her. Once you sign, it's done. No takebacks. Maggie nodded. That's the point. Paul slid a thick pen across the desk. The weight of it in her hand was startling, heavier than any she'd held before. She turned to the first page. The language was dense, but each clause was a wall, a barrier, a safeguard against the entitled voice that had mocked her in a cafe full of strangers. Irene leaned closer. She's not just out, Mags. She's locked out. You're building a vault and handing the key to kids who will actually deserve it, Maggie signed. The pen scratched quietly, but in her chest, it sounded like thunder. One page after another. Her signature, firm and final. When she reached the last, Paul placed a separate document in front of her. Living trust amendments. Executor designation. Irene raised her brows in surprise when Paul's eyes flicked toward her. You're naming me? Irene asked. Maggie smiled faintly. Who else do I trust to guard the gates? For once, Irene's sharp wit faltered. She swallowed hard, blinking behind her glasses before recovering with a brisk nod. Fine, but don't think I'm above haunting you if you make me work too hard. Maggie chuckled softly and signed. Paul stacked the documents, then opened a slim leather envelope. One more piece, he said. I always recommend a sealed letter. Not for the courts, strictly personal. A statement of intent in your own words. It removes doubt. Should there ever be questions about why? The paper in front of her felt more daunting than the legal pages. These weren't clauses or statutes. This was her voice, preserved. She picked up the pen, hesitated, then began. Her handwriting flowed steady, each loop and line deliberate. Chloe, I gave you my time, my work, my love. I paid for the education that should have freed you. Instead, you used it to distance yourself from me, to diminish me. A servant, you said. Perhaps you were right, but service given in love does not deserve scorn. For that reason, I leave my legacy not to you, but to those who understand sacrifice. When she finished, she folded the paper and slipped it into the envelope. Paul sealed it with a practiced press. They won't be able to touch this, Paul said, sliding the documents into his case with the precision of a surgeon closing a wound. Maggie exhaled, feeling the strange lightness that follows a hard decision made at last. She pictured the scholarship fund. her name etched onto something that would outlive betrayal. Irene pushed back her chair, a sly smile tugging at her lips. "Well then," she said, standing tall, "now let's watch the show." Maggie looked out the wide office window, where the city stretched toward the lake. The world outside bustled on, oblivious. But somewhere in those streets, Chloe was still laughing, still certain of the legacy waiting for her. She had no idea that the ground beneath her had already been pulled away. The chandelier light shimmered over rows of champagne glasses, casting the downtown loft in a golden haze. Maggie smoothed her navy dress, its fabric simple but dignified, chosen with care, not for flash. She had pinned her hair neatly, a touch of lipstick the only indulgence. Standing at the edge of the crowd, she looked less like someone's grandmother and more like a woman who knew exactly what ground she stood on. Chloe spotted her across the room, her smile stretching too wide. "Grandma, you made it," she swanned over, heels clicking, Devin at her side. His tailored suit whispered money and entitlement with every stitch. "I wouldn't miss it," Maggie said softly, handing over a small gift wrapped in crisp paper. Chloe took it with barely a glance, before pivoting toward her circle of guests. "Everyone, this is—" Chloe faltered, then laughed lightly, as though searching for the most harmless word. "Well, our family helper. She's been with me forever, practically raised me. But she likes to keep busy. Always helping, always fussing." The words floated out sweet as frosting, but cut with the same sharpness as that coffeehouse remark. The air shifted. Conversations near the canapé table slowed. Maggie felt dozens of curious eyes land on her, trying to square the elegant older woman with Chloe's dismissive label. Devin's mother, a tall woman in pearls and understated wealth, tilted her head. "Helper? I thought she was your grandmother. Didn't she raise you after your mother passed?" Chloe's smile stiffened. She gave a quick laugh. "Well, yes, technically, but you know how it is. She likes to think of herself as useful, always buzzing around like staff. It makes her happy," whispers spread like brush fire. A young man leaned into his date, murmuring something that made her glance at Maggie with new interest. Another woman raised her brows, clearly unimpressed. Maggie, however, stood serene. She did not flinch. She did not correct. She smiled, the kind of small, composed smile that reveals nothing. Years of night shifts and grieving silence had trained her face well. Inside, her pulse was steady, not from pride, but from the deep knowledge that Chloe's pedestal was already crumbling beneath her. Irene, dressed in a sharp emerald jacket that announced her refusal to blend into the wallpaper, sidled up to Maggie with a glass of sparkling water. "You want me to say it out loud, don't you?" she whispered. Maggie shook her head. "No, let them figure it out." Instead, Irene pulled out her phone, thumbs moving quickly. A subtle smile tugged at her mouth as she tapped and posted. No flourish, no grandstanding, just a single photo of Maggie with 2 nursing students from the scholarship's early promotional shoot. The caption was crisp, understated. "Tonight, while some measure worth in titles, others build futures." Maggie Sloan Scholarship. By the time Irene slipped the phone back into her clutch, the first notifications were already buzzing. Across the room, Devin's mother had not let it go. She sipped her champagne, eyes narrowing. "Funny," she said, voice carrying just enough. "In my circles, we call the woman who raised a child and paid her tuition something more than helper. We call her family." Chloe's laugh rang false, brittle. Of course. I didn't mean—" But the room had turned. Whispers became threads of judgment weaving through the party, binding Chloe in their knots. Maggie caught snippets. Ungrateful, all that money. Servant, really? She remained silent. Her smile never wavered. She had learned long ago that silence, held long enough, becomes a mirror. And Chloe, floundering in her own reflection, was beginning to drown. Irene touched Maggie's arm gently. "It's happening. Watch." Maggie's eyes moved across the loft, faces lit not with admiration for Chloe, but with skepticism, curiosity, even disdain. The tide had shifted, subtle but irreversible. She lifted her glass of water in a quiet toast to no one in particular. Not to Chloe, not to the crowd, to herself, to every hour that had led her here. And as laughter turned uneasy and whispers grew sharper, Maggie knew this was only the beginning. The newspaper hit Maggie's doorstep with a solid thump just after dawn. She bent carefully to pick it up, the cool air biting her cheeks. The front page was dominated by a headline in bold type: Retired Nurse Fund Scholarship for First-Gen Students. Below it was a photograph, Maggie standing in the university courtyard, flanked by 3 nursing students in scrubs, all grinning with bright, unguarded hope. Maggie herself looked almost surprised in the picture, caught mid-laugh when one of the students had wrapped an arm around her shoulders. The light had hit her silver hair just right, a halo against the fall leaves. She sat at the kitchen table, coffee warming her hands, staring at the photo. Irene arrived moments later, her phone already buzzing with alerts. "It's everywhere," she announced, sliding into the seat across from her. Social media's chewing it up, the hashtags trending. Maggie turned another page, where the story unfolded in neat columns. Her decades of nursing, her quiet sacrifices, her decision to fund futures instead of perpetuate entitlement. She felt no pride, just a bone-deep steadiness. The truth was finally wearing her face, not Chloe's. By mid-morning, Chloe's voice pierced the silence of Maggie's condo. She stormed through the door without knocking, her designer coat half off her shoulders, phone clutched in one manicured hand. "Are you kidding me?" she snapped, tossing the paper onto the table. Her eyes burned with fury. "You used my story," Maggie raised her gaze, calm as still water. "It was always my story." Chloe's face twisted. "I told people you sacrificed. I built my narrative on that. And now you're, what? Parading it around for strangers?" Irene barked out a laugh. "Parading? Honey, that's called telling the truth. Something you've been allergic to." Chloe whipped toward her. "Stay out of this. You're not family." Irene leaned back in her chair, unbothered. "Funny. That's what your mother used to say about me too. And yet, here I am, still around. Loyalty outlasts blood, kiddo." Maggie remained composed, sipping her coffee as Chloe's tirade filled the room. She no longer needed to shout back. Chloe's anger only revealed itself as insecurity. When Chloe finally paused for breath, Irene reached across the table and tapped the newspaper photo. "Look at that. That's legacy. Not the kind you wear on your wrist or park in your driveway, the kind that sticks after you're gone." Chloe's mouth opened, then closed. For once she had no quick retort. Maggie set her mug down, her voice quiet but unshakable. "You think the world owed you something because of what I gave you. But gifts don't create debts. They create responsibility. And you squandered yours." Chloe blinked, her anger flickering into something else. Fear, maybe, or realization, but it hardened again. "You'll regret this. You'll regret humiliating me like this." Maggie simply stood, guiding Chloe toward the door with a steady hand. "I regret nothing," she said. "Not anymore." The door closed on Chloe's sputtered protests. For a long moment the condo was silent, but for the ticking of the kitchen clock. Irene finally exhaled, slow and satisfied. "Keep being quiet, Mags," she said. "Quiet is sharp, cuts deeper than a shout." Maggie returned to the table, folded the newspaper neatly, and set it aside. Her hands didn't shake. That afternoon, Paul stopped by with his briefcase. He placed a thick envelope on the table and adjusted his tie. "All filings complete. The scholarship is formally established. Endowment, trust, tax shield. The whole fortress is in place. Not even the cleverest lawyer could breach it." Maggie touched the envelope lightly. "So it's done." "It's done," Paul confirmed. His eyes softened. "You've built something untouchable, something that will last." Outside, the October wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the faint hum of a world already turning toward the story of Maggie Sloan. retired nurse, benefactor. Chloe's version was shrinking, collapsing under the weight of reality. Maggie felt the quiet settle over her like a second skin. Not silence born of fear or dismissal, but silence chosen, wielded, sharpened. And somewhere, she knew Chloe was unraveling, her fury turning desperate, her grip on appearances slipping fast. The envelope was heavy, cream-colored, the kind that carried weight before it was even opened. Chloe snatched it off the stack of mail in Devon's apartment, her name written across the front in Maggie's looping hand. She didn't wait for a letter opener. Nails dug into the paper, tearing the seal in jagged strips. The folded pages slid free, the legal letterhead stark at the top. Her eyes darted down the first paragraph. Words leapt out like blows, revoked, rescinded, excluded. Then she found the line that stopped her cold. All gifts given are considered final, all future inheritance rescinded. Chloe's throat tightened. What the hell? Devon leaned over the back of the couch, plucking the paper from her trembling fingers. His jaw worked as he skimmed the clauses. She can't do this, he said finally, voice sharp. She raised you, she paid for everything, and now she just cuts you out? No, this won't stand. Chloe wrapped her arms around herself, nails digging into her sleeves. Her mind flicked through images, the scholarship article, her friends whispering after the party, her grandmother's steady silence. She tried to summon the easy confidence she usually wore like armor, but it slipped, leaving her raw. She already did, the voice came from the phone, set on speaker. Paul Grant's tone was measured, professional, but merciless. Chloe had called his office in a fury the moment she read the letter. She hadn't expected him to answer, but now his calm words landed like hammers. The will has been executed with airtight exclusion clauses. The trust has been amended. The endowment is secured. You were provided significant financial support over the years, which this letter recognizes as final gifts. You have no legal standing to contest. Devon's face reddened. That's ridiculous. She's manipulating the system. We'll get another lawyer. Paul's pause was deliberate. You're welcome to waste money on counsel, but you'll find the system doesn't bend for entitlement. Good day. The line clicked dead. Chloe stared at the papers scattered across the coffee table. The words seemed to grow heavier the longer she looked, pressing down, suffocating. Her grandmother's neat signature closed each page, bold, certain, unyielding. She hates me, Chloe whispered, her voice breaking. She actually hates me. Devon didn't answer. He was scrolling his phone, already looking for firms downtown, but his expression had soured. His jaw clenched, but his eyes were calculating, detached. Meanwhile, across town, Maggie sat in her condo with Irene, a notepad in front of her. On it was a single line of numbers, her new phone number. She'd written it carefully, then placed it beside the old cell, the one that had rung endlessly with Chloe's name flashing. She slid the old phone into a drawer and closed it. Changing your number feels cold, Maggie admitted softly. Irene set down her teacup with a firm clink. Cold? No, honey, it's boundary setting. Ice is stronger than fire when you need something to last. Maggie pressed her lips together, not trusting herself to answer. Irene leaned forward, her eyes bright with something that looked almost like mischief. Watch, she said. She'll come crawling. Pride first, anger next, then panic. They always crawl when the ground disappears under them. Maggie looked toward the sealed envelope Paul had left with her, a backup copy of the very letter Chloe now held in shaking hands. She thought of Chloe's face when she read it, imagined the fury, the disbelief. But she also felt the hollowness underneath, the grief of knowing the girl she raised had become a stranger to her. The condo was quiet, but Maggie felt the weight of the storm gathering elsewhere. Chloe would not retreat quietly. She would claw, rage, and demand. And Maggie knew this was only the beginning of how ugly desperation could get. The pounding on Maggie's condo door rattled the frame. She knew the rhythm before she even rose from her chair. It wasn't a knock, it was a demand. Irene, perched on the couch with her knitting needles clacking, didn't look up. "Told you," she said dryly. Panic stage. Maggie crossed the small living room and unlatched the door. Chloe pushed past her before she could even say hello, perfume and fury spilling into the quiet space. Her heels clicked sharp against the hardwood as she spun to face her grandmother. "Why are you punishing me?" Chloe's voice cracked at the edges, high and frantic. "You think this is fair? After everything I've been through? After everything you did for me?" Maggie shut the door gently, her movements calm in the storm. She didn't raise her voice, didn't match Chloe's anger. Instead, she walked to the sideboard, opened a drawer, and pulled out a neat stack of photocopied tuition checks. Years of ink and sacrifice, each line of her handwriting a testament. She laid them on the dining table, one by one, until Chloe's eyes flicked down. "I didn't punish you," Maggie said evenly. "I paid for you." Chloe's jaw clenched. She looked down at the checks as if they were foreign documents, then shoved them aside with a sharp sweep of her manicured hand. "That was your choice. Nobody asked you to martyr yourself." Irene's needles stilled. "She didn't martyr herself. She invested in you, sugar. Bad return, though." "Stay out of this," Chloe snapped, her eyes wild. Maggie didn't flinch. She stood with the weight of her years steady beneath her. "You think losing an inheritance is punishment? Punishment is working double shifts in a hospital ward and coming home to a child who never once says thank you. Punishment is watching you stand in front of strangers and call me a servant." Chloe's face flushed. "You embarrassed me at the party." Maggie's response was quiet, but it cut sharper than a shout. "No, you embarrassed yourself." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. Chloe's hands curled into fists at her sides. She opened her mouth, then closed it, words failing her for the first time. Irene leaned back into the couch, a satisfied glint in her eyes. Truth's funny that way. Doesn't need volume, just clarity. Chloe whirled toward the door, her hair whipping over her shoulder. "You're cruel," she hissed. "You'll die alone, and you'll deserve it." Maggie's heart pinched at the venom, but her face stayed composed. She didn't move, didn't follow, didn't argue. She simply watched as Chloe yanked the door open and stormed out, heels striking like gunshots down the hallway. The door slammed, and the echo lingered long after she was gone. For a while, neither woman spoke. Irene resumed her knitting, the soft click-clack filling the room again. "Finally," she said, "you did right not to chase her. Some people only learn by running out of places to run." Maggie sat slowly at the table, her hand brushing the scattered checks. They looked almost fragile now, edges fraying, numbers fading, but the truth they carried was solid, immovable. She gathered them into a stack and tucked them back into the drawer. Her chest ached, not from regret, but from the weight of letting go. The girl she raised was still in there somewhere, buried under pride and shame. But Maggie had finally stopped digging for her. She closed the drawer and straightened, her face set. Chloe's rage had left scorch marks, but Maggie would not let them consume her. Still, she knew this wasn't the end. Rage doesn't retreat quietly, it escalates. And Chloe's desperation had only just begun to show its teeth. By the end of the week, Chloe's name was in more mouths than she could control. It started with whispers among her social circle, snippets from the loft party, screenshots of Irene's tweet, a few shaky videos uploaded by guests who'd caught her family helper remark. Within days, it had grown teeth. "Granddaughter calls benefactor grandmother her servant," one headline sneered. Another, "When privilege devours gratitude." Blogs ran with it. Comment sections lit up like bonfires. Maggie watched none of it unfold firsthand. She didn't have social media accounts, didn't follow hashtags, but Irene kept her updated, perched on Maggie's sofa with her phone buzzing nonstop. "It's wildfire," Irene said, half appalled, half delighted. "People can smell entitlement from a mile away, and your Chloe just lit a match on her own reputation." Maggie only stirred sugar into her tea. "I didn't lift a finger," she murmured. Truth did. The fallout reached Devon's family next. His mother, who had asked the cutting question at the party, moved swiftly to protect her own. At a charity brunch, she was overheard saying, "We had no idea she came from such questionable values." The quote made it to a gossip column, then into public statements. Devon, under pressure, issued a careful press release announcing he and Chloe were taking time apart to reassess priorities. Irene nearly snorted tea out of her nose when she read it aloud. Translation: He's ditching her faster than a stock that tanked overnight. Chloe, meanwhile, was unraveling in real time. She had secured a job offer with a boutique marketing firm downtown, a gleaming opportunity she had flaunted to friends for weeks. Then came the email. "We regret to inform you that due to recent public perception issues, we are rescinding our offer." She forwarded the message to Maggie, no words attached, just the cold screenshot. Maggie stared at it, then closed her phone. She felt no triumph, only a strange ache that her granddaughter was learning the hardest lessons not through love, but through consequence. By the following Monday, Maggie's scholarship fund had become the story. The local news ran a segment featuring her smiling beside a group of nursing students. Donations surged. Strangers mailed checks with notes. "For the woman who teaches respect by example." Paul arrived at the condo one evening with his briefcase and a look of mild astonishment. "Your estate," he said, adjusting his tie, "has effectively doubled in a month. Between direct donations and matching contributions from the hospital board, the fund is larger than anything we projected for 10 years. Maggie blinked, the spoon in her hand hovering over a bowl of soup. "Doubled," Paul confirmed. "Chloe's disgrace became your platform. People don't just sympathize, they're investing in what you built." Irene leaned back, satisfaction glowing in her eyes. "See, Mags, sometimes karma doesn't knock. It delivers." Maggie didn't smile, though. She folded her napkin, resting her hands quietly in her lap. "I never wanted revenge," she said. "I only wanted the truth to stand taller than her lies." Paul nodded slowly. "It does. And now it's taller than both of you." But Maggie felt the unease creeping in, a reminder that Chloe's pride would not go quietly. Public humiliation only stoked the kind of fire that could burn through reason. That night, after Irene and Paul left, Maggie stood by her window, watching the city lights flicker across the lake. She remembered the girl Chloe once was, the child who used to press her face against the same glass, marveling at the twinkling horizon, whispering dreams Maggie had worked herself ragged to fund. That girl was gone, replaced by someone hollowed out by vanity. Maggie let the curtain fall closed. She whispered to herself, a vow more than a comfort. The truth will hold. Across town, Chloe scrolled through her phone under the dim glow of Devon's abandoned apartment. Notifications buzzed with strangers calling her spoiled, ungrateful, heartless. Each ding was another stone hurled at the fragile walls she had built around her image. Her hands shook, but her anger simmered hotter than her shame. She typed furiously into a blank post, her face tight with determination. If the world thought she was a villain, she would fight it with every ounce of venom she had left. The letter arrived on thick legal stationery, embossed in gold ink, as though prestige could disguise desperation. Paul spread it across Maggie's dining table, his expression flat. Chloe's new attorney accused Maggie of undue influence, emotional manipulation, and malicious defamation of character. The final demand was bold: reinstate Chloe as heir or face litigation. Paul slid the pages aside with a faint sigh. "Classic bluff," he said. "New grads trying to prove themselves send letters like this every day. They dress it up with adjectives to scare you." Maggie poured him coffee, steady as ever. "Do I need to answer?" "I already did." He reached into his briefcase and produced a copy of his reply. It was 2 lines long. "Your claim has no merit. Pursue further, and my client will seek recovery of all legal costs." At the bottom, in bold, Paul had added, "Invoice attached." Irene, seated nearby with her ever-present knitting, barked a laugh. You build them? Paul sipped his coffee. Of course. If they want to waste time, they can pay for mine. The letter, heavy with threats, seemed almost pathetic beside Paul's crisp dismissal. Maggie tucked it back into the envelope without ceremony. She felt no jolt of fear, no lingering doubt. The silence of her resolve was louder than any legal jargon. By nightfall, Chloe struck back the only way she knew how, publicly. She posted a sprawling rant online, nearly 1,000 words, dripping with venom. In it, she painted herself as a victim of an abusive matriarch who controlled her life with money, weaponized guilt, and now sought revenge by humiliating her. She called the scholarship a vanity project, claimed Maggie was exploiting her story, and ended with a plea for understanding from anyone who's ever been trapped by toxic family. Irene had screenshots within minutes. Downloaded, time-stamped, archived, she said, scrolling with satisfaction. If she tries to delete it later, we've got the receipts. Paul only raised a brow when he read it. Defamation cuts both ways, he murmured. If she escalates, she'll find herself paying damages she can't afford. But Maggie didn't read the post at all. She had no desire to roll in the mud Chloe was busy flinging. Instead, she spent her day where she belonged, in the small clinic on the east side of town, where retirees lined up for flu shots and young families came in for checkups they could actually afford. She moved from room to room, steady hands and soft words, the old instincts of nursing filling her like breath. When a little boy with nervous eyes refused to let anyone near his arm, Maggie knelt, pulling a sticker from her pocket, a leftover from her teaching days on the ward. Superhero shield, she whispered, pressing it onto his tiny hand. He nodded solemnly, braver now. The needle went in without a tear. By the time she left the clinic, her coat buttoned against the early winter chill, she felt lighter. Chloe's rage belonged to another world, one that seemed smaller every time Maggie stepped into the places where her work still mattered. That evening, Irene appeared again with her phone alight, waving it like a flare. Mags, you're trending again. The hospital just announced the first scholarship cohort. They published photos, the 5 students who'll receive full rides next year. Look at these faces. Maggie peered at the screen. 5 young women and men stood shoulder to shoulder, white coats draped over their arms, grinning as if the future had just unlocked for them. The caption read, "The Maggie Sloan Scholars, first of many." Her throat tightened. She hadn't expected to live long enough to see it take root, and yet here it was, already blooming. Irene lowered the phone, her expression softening. See? This is the real fight, and you've already won it. Maggie closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of that truth settle. She had built something Chloe couldn't touch, couldn't smear, couldn't destroy. But as Irene scrolled, her brow furrowed. Uh-oh, she turned the phone. A new post from Chloe had just gone live. Angrier, darker, and gathering traction fast. The war for Maggie's legacy wasn't finished. Chloe had only begun to bear her claws. The letters arrived in a thick manila envelope, stamped with the university seal. Maggie slid it open carefully, her hands steady though her chest thudded. Inside were 6 handwritten notes, each one folded neatly, each one carrying a different hand. She spread them out on the dining table, smoothing the creases as if they were fragile artifacts. Irene hovered at her shoulder, knitting forgotten in her lap, her curiosity sharpened into reverence. Maggie picked one at random. The penmanship was uneven, hurried. Mrs. Sloan, my parents never made it past 8th grade. They wanted me to work at the plant, but I've always dreamed of nursing. Your scholarship means I don't have to quit halfway through. I'll be the first in my family to wear scrubs with pride. Thank you. Maggie's throat closed. She pressed her fingers to her lips, as though the words might spill out. Another letter, this one in neat, looping script. You don't know me, but you've changed my life. I want to work in pediatrics. And now I can focus on caring for kids instead of juggling 2 jobs to stay in school. You gave me time, and time is everything. Her vision blurred. She dabbed at her cheeks with a tissue, but the tears fell faster than she could catch them. Irene reached over, wrapping her arms around her friend. "Let it out, Mags. This is what legacy feels like." Maggie leaned into the hug, shoulders shaking, her tears soaking Irene's emerald sweater. For years, her sacrifices had been invisible. Over time, paychecks folded into tuition checks. Meals skipped so Chloe could eat well. Hours of her life poured into someone else's future. Now, for the first time, gratitude was staring back at her in ink. By the time she pulled away, her cheeks were damp, but her expression had softened. She read through the rest, each voice different but carrying the same current of hope, gratitude, and determination. A chorus of futures she had helped unlock. Later that week, a polite email arrived from a local TV station. They wanted Maggie to appear on their evening broadcast, a special about elder respect and the impact of her scholarship. The producer wrote effusively about human interest and setting an example for the community. Irene was thrilled. "You'd look great on camera, Mags. America needs to see this face. Steel and kindness in one package." But Maggie only shook her head, closing the laptop gently. "No, my place isn't on a stage. The work is enough." Irene frowned. "You sure? I've spent a lifetime speaking softly and letting action speak loudest. I don't need a spotlight now." Paul, when he heard of the invitation, only smiled. "You've outgrown revenge," he said, his voice carrying quiet pride. "This isn't about Chloe anymore. This is impact, and it will ripple far longer than any scandal." Maggie sat with that thought long into the night, her tea cooling beside her. She had once believed revenge was a kind of balance, taking back what had been stolen. But now she saw it differently. Her strength wasn't in what she took from Chloe. It was in what she gave to others, what she built that could not be torn down. Still, in the quiet, when the house settled into creaks and sighs, she felt the shadow of Chloe's rage looming just outside her door. Gratitude from strangers filled her, but the ache of betrayal lingered like an old wound, dull, constant, reminding her the storm wasn't over. She gathered the letters into a neat stack and tied them with ribbon, placing them gently in the sideboard drawer where the tuition checks once lay. Different papers now, different meaning. Before turning off the light, she whispered to herself, almost a prayer, "Let this be what lasts." Across the city, Chloe sat hunched over her laptop, her face lit by the glow of the screen. Her fingers flew across the keys, venom pouring into another draft post. The comments from strangers gnawed at her, but her fury only deepened. If her grandmother thought she could erase her, Chloe was determined to make noise loud enough to drown the silence. The clip wasn't polished or staged. It was shaky phone footage from Chloe herself, filmed in a dim apartment with blinds drawn tight. Her eyes were red, her hair disheveled, her voice a rapid-fire mix of outrage and desperation. "She's ruining my life," Chloe said into the camera, her voice cracking. "My grandmother, if you can even call her that, spent years controlling me, smothering me, making me feel like I owed her everything. And now she's painting herself as some saint? She wasn't a mother, she was. She was my servant, and she knew it. She wanted it that way." She hit post at 2 a.m. By sunrise, it was everywhere. Comment sections filled instantly, not with sympathy, but with fury. "You called your grandma a servant," one user wrote, racking up thousands of likes. Another, "She paid for your college and you're still ungrateful?" The words stacked up like stones, a barrage she hadn't braced for. Within hours, influencers were stitching her rant into their own videos. A young nurse in scrubs looked into the camera and said, "If my grandmother had done for me what Maggie Sloan did for her, I'd worship the ground she walked on." The video hit 1 million views in a day. Devin, who had been reassessing priorities, finally snapped under the public glare. His statement appeared on Instagram. "I cannot condone disrespect toward family or the values my own parents raised me with. The engagement is officially off. I wish her healing, but I will not stand beside her choices. The internet devoured it. Screenshots of Chloe's engagement photos circulated, now paired with captions like, "From diamond ring to dust in a week." By evening, Chloe's name was trending again, only this time as a cautionary tale. "Don't be a Chloe" became shorthand for ungratefulness, plastered across memes, tweets, and even t-shirts someone started selling online. Chloe fought back at first, hammering replies into the void, but each response only fueled the fire. Strangers dissected every word, every tone, every hint of entitlement. Finally, unable to take the avalanche, she deactivated her accounts entirely. Her online presence vanished in a single click, leaving behind the echo of her own implosion. At her condo, Maggie heard about it from Irene, who burst through the door with her phone buzzing like a hive. "It's over, Mags," she said breathlessly, collapsing onto the couch. She tried to weaponize her voice, but the internet turned it right back on her. Maggie was quiet. She sat at the kitchen table, sipping her tea, gazing out the window at the fading light across the lake. She hadn't read Chloe's rant. She hadn't seen the memes or the clips or the commentary. The storm raged outside, but inside, her world was still, calm, unshaken. Irene studied her, then said softly, "You're handling this like a queen." Maggie's lips curved faintly. "No, queens command armies. I only kept my silence." "That's exactly it," Irene replied, leaning forward. "Silence is your crown." She's flailing, screaming, drowning in her own noise. "And you've turned stillness into power." The words settled into Maggie like a truth she had carried all along. Silence wasn't absence, it was choice. It was the sharpest blade she could wield. Still, as Irene scrolled through the remnants of Chloe's collapse, Maggie felt a heaviness in her chest. Watching a granddaughter unravel wasn't victory, not really. It was just consequence, stark and unavoidable. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, barely audible, let her find peace, somewhere. But when she opened them, the quiet conviction returned. She would not bend. She would not break. Because silence was not surrender, it was sovereignty. And if Chloe thought disappearing online meant retreat, Maggie knew better. The girl's pride hadn't burned out yet. It had only gone underground. The courthouse smelled of varnish and old paper, a hush hanging heavy over the marble halls. Maggie walked slowly beside Paul, each of her steps deliberate. She wore the same navy dress from Chloe's graduation party, not as a statement, but because it made her feel steady. Irene followed close behind, her emerald jacket bright as a flag in the sea of gray suits. Inside the courtroom, Chloe sat at the petitioner's table, hair smoothed into a glossy curtain, posture rigid. Her lawyer, young, eager, with a tie knotted too tightly, shuffled papers like they could conjure credibility. Chloe's eyes flicked to Maggie and then away, a flash of panic buried beneath a mask of indignation. "All rise." The judge, a woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen it all, entered and took her seat. The room settled. Chloe's lawyer launched first, his words slick and quick. "Your Honor, this case centers on undue influence. My client, Chloe Sloan, asserts that her grandmother, Margaret Sloan, was not acting of sound mind when she disinherited her. She was coerced." Maggie's lips pressed together, but she said nothing. Paul sat like stone beside her, waiting his turn. The lawyer continued, leaning into theatrics. What rational elder would erase her only living descendant? Clearly there was manipulation, perhaps by outside parties. His hand flicked vaguely toward Irene, who rolled her eyes so dramatically the bailiff almost smiled. The judge finally raised a brow. "You're asserting mental incapacity. Provide evidence." Chloe's lawyer brightened, producing a folder. "We allege Miss Sloane's decisions were not fully her own, clouded by emotional distress and coercion. My client has testimony to—" Paul rose with quiet precision. "Your Honor, with the court's permission," the judge nodded. Paul laid a series of documents on the evidence table, each sheet sliding into place like a blade. Exhibit A, 4 years of annual cognitive evaluations, each performed independently, each affirming full capacity. Exhibit B, copies of tuition checks, loan statements, and financial records proving over $100,000 paid directly by Mrs. Sloan for Ms. Chloe Sloan's education. Exhibit C, sworn statements from the university bursar confirming payment. He paused, letting the weight of the paper stack settle. And Exhibit D, the petitioner's own social media posts. He clicked a remote, and the courtroom monitor lit up with Chloe's online trail. Tweets, rants, the viral video calling Maggie her servant. Each one appeared in stark black and blue against the white screen. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Paul's voice never rose. If anything demonstrates undue influence, it is the petitioner's influence upon herself. Chloe's lawyer sputtered. These posts, taken out of context. The judge cut him off. The context seems clear enough. Her gaze landed on Chloe, sharp and unflinching. Do you dispute making these statements? Chloe shifted in her seat, her voice tight. I was emotional. Everyone says things they don't mean online. Perhaps, the judge replied evenly. But intent is irrelevant when it reveals state of mind. You've shown contempt, not coercion. The silence was suffocating. Finally, the gavel came down once, clean and decisive. The court finds the will valid and enforceable. The petition is denied. Furthermore, petitioner is ordered to pay respondent's legal fees. Chloe's face drained of color. Her lawyer whispered furiously, but the damage was done. The bailiff gathered papers. The crowd murmured, and the judge moved briskly to the next case, as if this one were no more complicated than a traffic ticket. Maggie stood slowly, her back straightened, her chin lifted, and though her knees ached, her stride carried the weight of victory without gloating. She did not look at Chloe. She didn't need to. Outside the courthouse, the October air was crisp, the sky wide and clear above the Capitol dome. Reporters lingered, but Paul waved them off, his briefcase swinging casually at his side. Maggie descended the steps one measured pace at a time. Irene slipped an arm through hers, her voice low but fierce with satisfaction. You served her consequences on a silver platter. Maggie's mouth curved in the faintest smile. I only served the truth. But as she looked out at the cluster of cameras waiting across the street, she knew Chloe wasn't finished. Defeat in court rarely extinguished a fire like hers. It only fanned it into something darker. The lake shimmered like glass under the late autumn sun, the air cool but gentle enough for tea outdoors. Maggie sat at a small iron table near the shoreline, her navy scarf pulled close, steam curling from the china cup in her hands. The courthouse victory still lingered in her bones, but instead of triumph, she felt something softer, space at last, for beginnings. She heard footsteps crunching over the gravel path. Olivia approached with a shy smile, clutching her own thermos and a small paper bag. She was younger than Maggie expected, barely 20, with dark curls tied back, and an earnestness in her eyes that reminded Maggie of the first nurses she trained decades ago. Mrs. Sloan, Olivia asked tentatively. Maggie gestured to the empty chair. Call me Maggie. Sit, dear. Olivia settled in, unwrapping 2 still warm scones from the bag. I baked these myself. Well, tried to. The bottoms might be burnt. Maggie laughed softly, accepting one. I've eaten worse on night shifts. Trust me. For a few minutes, they simply sipped and watched the lake. Ducks skimmed the water, their ripples spreading wide. Maggie found her chest unclenching in the quiet company. Finally, Olivia spoke. I wanted to meet you face to face, not just to say thank you, but to tell you something. Her hands twisted nervously around her thermos. I don't have grandparents. They passed before I was born. My parents worked 2 jobs each just to keep food on the table. When I got the scholarship letter, I cried for a week straight. I didn't think people like me got miracles. Maggie's throat tightened, but she stayed silent, letting Olivia gather courage. The young woman's voice softened. I want to be the kind of granddaughter you deserved. The words struck like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. Maggie's eyes burned as she reached across the table, her weathered hand covering Olivia's. You already are, she whispered. Behind them, Irene stood a little apart, pretending to fuss with her phone. But her glasses were fogged, and when she finally joined them, she swiped at her cheeks with the edge of her sleeve. Well, she said gruffly, clearing her throat. Now you've gone and made me cry in public. People will think I'm sentimental. Maggie smiled, her hand still clasped with Olivia's. For the first time in months, the ache inside her felt less like loss and more like transformation. The afternoon stretched on with easy conversation, Olivia sharing dreams of pediatrics, Maggie recalling long nights on the cardiac ward, Irene interrupting with quips that made them both laugh. It wasn't family by blood, but it was family by choice, forged in gratitude and respect instead of obligation. Later that week, Maggie sat again in Paul's office, the familiar scent of lemon polish and paper surrounding her. She slid a fresh document across his desk, already signed. Paul adjusted his glasses, reading carefully. You're naming Olivia as honorary executor? Yes, Maggie said firmly. She doesn't know yet, but I want her to carry this forward someday. Not money, that part is already decided. I want her to carry the spirit of it. To keep the scholarship alive, Paul nodded, a rare smile tugging at his lips. You're building a legacy that breathes. When Maggie left his office, the weight of paperwork no longer felt like chains. It felt like scaffolding, something solid to hold up the future. That evening, as she walked by the lake again, she paused to watch the sunset bleed into the horizon. For years she had feared dying alone, her love unacknowledged, her sacrifices forgotten. Now she knew better. Family wasn't always inherited. Sometimes it was chosen, built deliberately, like the scholarship, like the laughter she had shared with Olivia that afternoon. She whispered into the wind, more to herself than anyone else. This is the family I built. But even as the calm settled over her, a shadow stirred at the edges of her mind. Chloe was still out there, pride wounded, name tarnished, but not silenced. And people with nothing left to lose often struck hardest. The condo smelled of lasagna and garlic bread, the warmth of the oven filling every corner with comfort. Maggie moved slowly but surely between the kitchen and the dining table, her navy apron tied snug around her waist. The table was set simply, mismatched plates, a vase of late-season chrysanthemums, and glasses that caught the glow of lamplight. One by one, her guests arrived. Irene first, sweeping in with her usual blunt affection, carrying a bottle of red wine she admitted she didn't know how to pair. Paul came next, briefcase still in hand out of habit, though his tie was loosened. Then Olivia arrived, cheeks flushed with excitement, holding a homemade pie. 2 scholarship recipients trailed shyly behind her, both clutching small gifts, a card, a candle, gestures of gratitude too large to fit into objects. They gathered around the table, laughter building even before the meal began. Maggie served generous portions of lasagna, watching with satisfaction as the students dove in with the hunger of both youth and relief. The plaque hung on the wall above them, polished bronze with crisp lettering. The Maggie Sloan Scholarship Fund. For first-generation nurses, carried forward by kindness. Maggie caught Olivia glancing at it between bites, her expression reverent. Paul raised his glass in a quiet toast. To Maggie Sloan, who turned sacrifice into legacy. Irene clinked glasses all around. And to me, who gets to say I told you so? Laughter rippled through the room, warm and unforced. For the first time in what felt like forever, Maggie's house felt alive, not with tension, not with old grief, but with genuine joy. As plates emptied and stories flowed, Maggie sat back in her chair, hands folded in her lap. She studied the faces around her, students full of promise, friends who had stood beside her when truth cut deepest. Blood had betrayed her, but here sat family forged in choice. This, she said softly, her voice caring enough to still the chatter. This is my family now. The room grew quiet for a beat. Then Olivia reached across the table, her young hand brushing Maggie's. You gave me a chance I never thought I'd have. You gave all of us a chance. Maggie squeezed her hand gently. Words caught in her throat. Later, when the night had thinned and the table was littered with crumbs and wine glasses, Maggie retreated to her study. She pulled out her leather journal, the same one she had carried through years of hospital shifts and quiet nights alone. She wrote slowly, each letter deliberate, steady, kindness deserved, boundaries enforced. She stared at the words for a long time before closing the journal. Paul appeared in the doorway, briefcase tucked under his arm. One last thing, he said quietly. He set a folder on the desk. Inside was the final version of her will, everything bound, witnessed, and ready. Maggie lifted the pen, her hand steady and despite the tremor of age. With a deep breath, she signed her name, ink flowing smooth and resolute. When she lifted the pen, she felt a weight leave her chest. Paul nodded once, firm. Irrevocable. This is the last draft you'll ever need. Maggie closed the folder, sliding it back across the desk. Her gaze drifted once more to the laughter spilling from the dining room, Irene telling some exaggerated story, while the students laughed so hard one nearly spilled water across the table. Her lips curved into the gentlest of smiles. The ache of betrayal no longer defined her. It had been replaced, piece by piece, with something stronger, peace built on her own terms. She whispered the words, not for Paul, not for Irene, not even for the students in the next room. She whispered them for herself, a seal on everything she had endured. After paying for her college, my granddaughter told her friends I was just the servant, so I served her nothing in my will.